It's an honor to be with you today and participate in this session of the T20 on global policy proposals for prosperity, finance, and trade. I would like to thank most especially Paolo Magri, the T20 National Coordinator and Chair of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and James McGann, co-chair of T20 Task Force and director of the Think Tanks and Civil Society Programs of the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for your kind invitation. A warm greeting to all of you, all of us, and all of you joining from around the world. Until recently, to talk of the post COVID world was to describe a very distant aspiration, but for many parts of the world, it still is. In 2020, the COVID 19 pandemic ravaged countries at all levels of development, triggering the biggest global crisis in decades without distinguishing between income levels. High, middle, and low income countries alike were devastated by the systemic and economic impact of the virus. Numbers speak for themselves. The global economy contracted 3.3% in 2020, with a loss of the equivalent of 114 million full-time jobs relative to 2019 level. Extreme poverty rose and inequality as well, for the first time over 2 decades. My region, Latin America and the Caribbean, has been especially hardly hit. ECLAC estimates that the region GDP contracted by 7.1% of GDP in 2020, representing the worst crisis in 120 years and the largest contraction in the developing world, with a loss of 42 million jobs. The crisis led to a sharp increase in unemployment and pushing an additional 22 million people into poverty for a total of 209 million people, an increasing number of people in extreme poverty by 8 million to 78 million people across the region. In contrast to the systemic shock caused by the pandemic, the response of the crisis has underscored existing asymmetries between developed and developing countries. Most advanced economies mobilize 16.4% of GDP in additional expenditures and tax credits, and 11.3% of their combined GDP in loans, capital, and guarantees, compared to 10.7 and 7.2% respectively in emerging markets. Latin America and the Caribbean governments mobilized significant resources to address the impacts of the pandemic, spending 4.6% of GDP in emergency responses and 2.5% in public credit guarantees. However, the region lacks the fiscal space to address the crisis with the same firepower of developed countries. Moreover, the economic and social effects of COVID 19, and as well as the policy measures to address them, have significantly increased the region's financing needs, increasing, for example, public debt by more than 10 percentage points of GDP. Our region is the most indebted region in the developing world, 77% of GDP, and the region's largest external debt service as a percentage of exports of goods and services, which entails 59%. For many developed countries, the post COVID world is no longer a distant aspiration. Welcome that. And many have moved already beyond the emergency responses and are actively redesigning the contours of a post COVID society with new approaches to labor market, welfare, and productive policies supported by expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. However, developing countries do not yet have that luxury. We do not have the luxury of realizing a post COVID reality. First, the unequal access to vaccines will make impossible to leave the crisis behind. And we are confronted a clearly divided world with islands of immunity in the developed world. Second, the significant asymmetries between developed and developing countries in terms of borrowing costs, market access, representation in international financial institutions, and in industrial and technological capabilities prevent developing countries from implementing the same transformative recovery plans that developed countries are crafting. A divergent recovery where green investments will stem the recovery in Europe and the US, while regions like ours are lagging behind sustainability and equality. Multilateral measures in vaccines, financing, trade, and investment hold great potential to reduce these structural asymmetries and support transformative economic recovery to achieve a more sustainable and inclusive development model. The number one priority should be ending the current pandemic in 2022. As envisioned by G7 leaders at the Carbis Bay Summit, to do that, we need to vaccinate as many people as possible and as fast as possible. This is not only a moral imperative, but the most effective way of relaunching the global economy. All possible avenues should be explored. Of course, a very important one is the donation of vaccines doses by developed countries to developing countries, especially to least developed countries, but also middle income through the COVAX facility. But we must also increase the manufacturing capabilities in all regions. Voluntary licensing arrangements should be encouraged, as well as progress in the ongoing discussions at the WTO on a temporary suspension of patents on COVID-19 vaccines. We should also promote a global commitment to lift export restrictions on key inputs needed for the production of vaccines, as well as on other essential medical products. The second key set of actions relate to finance first and to finance. First, liquidity must be expanded and redistributed from developed to developing countries, including middle income countries. The proposal to allocate 650 billion worth of SDRs, of special drawing rights, is a step in the right direction. But to redress the imbalance in the redistribution of SDRs between developed and developing countries, resulting from the existing quota system, requires a SDR more effective reallocation and more fair. This will not in itself cover the entire financing gap of developing countries. This should be complemented with other initiatives such as the multilateral funds like the Costa Rica proposed fund to alleviate COVID-19, FASE or FACE. Regional cooperation and intra-regional trade should be strengthened by improving the lending and the response capabilities of regional, sub-regional, and national financial institutions. Cooperation by multilateral development banks have fallen below the financial levels granted during the crisis of 2008. Most of the increase in financing provided by the World Bank, for example, has been channeled, through the International Development Association, IDA. That is, we need, of course, to lower income countries through concessional funding, but we also need concessional funding in middle income countries. In Latin America and the Caribbean, only 8 countries have been able to receive concessional financing from the World Bank. And the Inter-American Development Bank is granting concessional funding only to 4 economies in the region, so we need more. Thirdly, the multilateral debt architecture requires institutional reform. Middle income countries, which hold the bulk of the debt of developing countries, have been the most affected by the rise of debt levels. G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI, which today covers only low income countries, is not sufficient. We need to go beyond that, and we need to really extend and expand the DSSI, and this has to be part of a reform of the multilateral debt architecture to create a multilateral debt restructuring mechanism and the establishment, by the way, of a multilateral credit rating agency. Fourthly, expanding the toolbox of innovative instruments is key to improve the debt repayment capacity and avoid debt distress. This entails making hurricane clauses, for example, a permanent feature of debt relief. Also, stage contingent debt instruments must take into account the importance of the external sector, including exports, imports, and terms of trade. The governance of global trade and foreign direct investment has been greatly strained in recent years. So, on the one hand, the rules of multilateral trading system So is from the mid 90s, and thus they are very inadequate to meet the new challenges such as climate change, digital revolution, and the rapid rise of new actors and the ongoing pandemics. FDI, by the way, governance has become increasingly controversial. Traditional investment agreements had often privileged the rights of foreign investors over the right of host governments to regulate in their public interest and pursue national development goals. On the other hand, the governance of FDI has become increasingly controversial. So we have to restore definitely multilateral cooperation on trade and foreign direct investment to relaunch the global economy and achieve a more sustainable and inclusive development pattern. In particular, we need greater coherence between the rules of the multilateral trading system and the sustainable development goals. G20, by the way, can serve as a laboratory to explore new initiatives that can be brought to WTO and other relevant fora. Ensuring that the recovery in global trade and FDI extends beyond 2021 is key. We need the resumption of FDI after the fall of 42% in 2020. We need FDI flows, not only to create decent jobs, but also to encourage the transition towards a greener and more sustainable global economy. To ensure a sustained recovery of trade and FDI, we must avoid repeating the trade tensions of recent years. And to do this, we must move ahead with the long delayed process of the WTO reform. I'm sure this will advance under the leadership of its new director, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. We need to tackle urgently the issue of dispute settlement so that trade disputes do not continue to be managed unilaterally by largest players. We need to find rules and mechanisms to ensure that different economic models can coexist without disrupting the global trade, and new rules that adequately meet global challenges and changes. The ongoing WTO negotiations on investment facilitation is a great opportunity to align more closely the rules with Agenda 2030. The WTO negotiations on e-commerce are crucial to ensure that all countries can benefit from the digital revolution with no country being left behind, and to avoid the regulatory fragmentation of the internet. All of these multilateral measures, including, for example, the right of countries to tax digital reforms, must be linked to medium and long run development objectives, including environmental sustainability, digital inclusion, among others. In particular, climate change is probably the biggest challenge confronting humanity. So we need urgently global trade rules to encourage and speed up the transition to a more sustainable production and consumption patterns, supporting both mitigation and adaptation efforts. Also, to provide incentives to clean production methods, energy efficiency, and circular economy. But we need intellectual property rules that promote the global diffusion of clean technologies. Moving quickly and meaningfully to align global trade routes with the respect for planetary boundaries is probably the most important challenge that we are facing today. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we believe that strengthening regional integration is key to achieving a more inclusive and sustainable development pattern. In 2020, the region's export, for example, fell 10%, while interregional trade fell 20%. The latter is basically because manufactured goods have been falling apart, which is heavily, and now the region is heavily dependent on primary products. Without greater integration, it will be difficult for the region to diversify its export basket and develop the capabilities for small and medium-sized enterprises. Achieving these laudable goals for developing countries will require international cooperation, reducing the asymmetries by enabling policy space for sustainable industrialization in developing economies, including investment and trade cooperation, intellectual property rules that promote global diffusion of clean technologies, and capacity building are important areas for a global fair green recovery with equality. Ensuring a broad-based global recovery for developed and developing countries alike is not simply a matter of solidarity, it's a matter of mutual interest. And this is why international cooperation is crucial. The pandemic will not end until people everywhere are vaccinated and safe. Climate change threatens countries at all levels of development. Overcoming these global challenges will require a global covenant, a global pact to close the asymmetries and the global divide. And that will permit developing countries and all countries at all levels of development to achieve together a more sustainable and inclusive development pattern in the post COVID world. Thank you.